So when I went to University of Toronto as an undergraduate, I immediately noticed these differences between the U.S. and Canada, and I wanted to be able to explain them. And one of the things that I found really interesting was, as an undergrad, I took a course on the history of the Canadian West. And I learned about the differences with the Canadian West and the way the Canadian frontier developed differently than the United States did. So the American frontier, we think of the lawless frontier, the images of the cowboys, of gunfights, of marauding Indians, things like this. In Canada, the government arrived first. They established relations with the Indians before white settlers arrived. Law and order was present on the Canadian frontier before settlers arrived, and you had a very different role of government. These are things that have interested me for a very long time, and I've decided in the last couple of years to sort of develop this into a more serious research agenda. My overall question that is sort of driving all of my research now is to what extent can the history and the mythology of the North American frontier help explain the differences in politics and political culture between the United States and Canada today? That's sort of my broad research question. And I've been doing some different types of conference papers, got involved in new kinds of organizations and all of this. And looking at the mythology, when we think about it, and I already mentioned this a second ago, the national self-images of America's self-image and Canada's self-image are quite different. So the icons and myths of the American frontier, we have the Wild West. In Canada, there's actually a term called the Mild West, in which Canadians very proudly point out that actually we had a mild West. We did not have a violent West. There were no Indian wars in Canada. There were no massacres of Indians on the Canadian frontier as there was in the United States. So the image of the Canadian law-abiding, nonviolent, the honorable treatment of Indians is part of the Canadian self-image, and they've put a lot of emphasis on this, comparing especially us Canadians to you Americans. Also, there's the political motto of Canada is peace, order, and good government. And that actually goes back to the founding document of Canada, the British North America Act of 1867, when the Dominion was first created. And we can all see as Americans are familiar with American culture how different this is from the American image. Competing cultural icons. In the American West, and also sort of like the American image, is the lone armed cowboy, who, when that cowboy becomes an outlaw, stands against government. The Canadian icon, and if you go to Canada, you can actually see in tourist shops and all sorts of stuff, the icon of Canada is the Mountie, the Northwest Mounted, or the Royal Canadian Mounted Policeman. Margaret Atwood, who is a Canadian author, once quipped that Canada must be the only country in the world that uses a policeman as its national symbol. Okay, so these are some of the differences, the overall differences sort of driving my research agenda. I started doing various things, looking at gun culture, other aspects. And I started looking also at the Indian policy, and this is where I ended up going off with this particular article that I want to talk about. So the specific question of my article is, how can we explain the stark differences in policy toward American Indians and Canada's First Nations? And that's what today in Canada, they refer to them as First Nations. And which conceptual approach best accounts for these differences? And one of the things that's driving my overall research agenda is I've identified different approaches for analyzing my overall topic, drawing on different bodies of literature. And I'm going to go through that very quickly in a second. So the article itself has two goals. The first is to specify and develop this three-part conceptual framework, which is going to be used in all of my future research in different papers, and ultimately as sort of the conceptual framework for a book. And basically, this framework is something that could be used for myself, but could also be used in the fields of comparative politics and in the fields of Canadian studies and North American studies, and those are academic fields. So I specify these three, and in the article itself that just recently got published, I spend a little bit of time going through these three different models. And then finally, to apply that framework in a qualitative comparative analysis of national policies towards indigenous peoples, and I'm very specific where I'm looking at. I'm looking at the post-1865, so post-American Civil War, or post-1867, post-Confederation, trans-Mississippi West. So I'm looking at the West that we think of, not, say, the East or the Southeast or anything like that. And specifically, even more specifically, I'm looking at the Alberta-Montana borderlands. So I'm going to bring these all up. There are three basic conceptual models or conceptual approaches that I've identified. And I do this largely through a literature review. And I'm going to really talk mainly about the last two of the three. The first is drawing on the work of Frederick Jackson Turner, who is sort of the seminal American historian, who probably one of the most famous American historians, who basically came up with what was called the frontier thesis. And then I look at what he had to say, plus a lot of newer historians that have challenged and critiqued him. But I argue that I call it the Turnerian discourse because they all are sort of in a closed feedback loop. All of these new Western historians are engaging Turner on his own terms. And so that sort of becomes one approach to examine what's going on. Then there are two others. One is what's called a Lipset thesis. Some of you may be familiar with Seymour Martin Lipset. Seymour Martin Lipset was a very famous political sociologist, but he had a specific argument for explaining the differences between the United States and Canada, and that was going back to the origins of the nations. And he basically argued that America was the revolutionary society, and Canada was the counter-revolutionary society. And where the American Revolution went in one direction, Canada took a decidedly different approach. And that these different approaches actually sort of fed on themselves, and they helped lead to sort of different path-dependent developmental trajectories for the U.S. and Canada. And basically what he argues is that the values and culture moved west as the countries expanded. Frederick Jackson Turner made a very opposite argument. He said that what was new about America was the West itself, and that democracy moved from west to east. And so I compare in this article and also in other stuff, how does the Lipset thesis challenge Turner and vice versa? But the Lipset thesis is inherently comparative because it's looking at the U.S. and Canada, and it's saying that these are these fundamental differences. There's a whole other area called borderland studies, and this is an interdisciplinary approach that's fairly new. It goes back maybe the last 10 years or so, 10 or 15 years. And whereas Lipset stresses the differences between the U.S. and Canada and the differences between countries that sort of are like they load the dice in how the countries develop, Borderlands thesis makes a very different argument, and it looks at the similarities across socially constructed borders. And it basically argues that the borders between countries are socially constructed, and that basically what areas of the Borderlands region have in common can be more important than the differences between the countries. So, for example, the Borderlands regions of Montana, Alberta, or of Texas and Mexico, you have cultures that develop, and frankly, those ties and those identities sometimes are stronger than the boundaries that are created. So these two approaches are very different than each other. And one of the things that I look at in the paper is I sort of examine to what extent do I see evidence of the Lipset thesis explaining why the U.S. and Canadian policies were different towards Indians, and to what extent do I see evidence of the Borderland Studies approach. And also I look at the third one as well. What I argue in the paper ultimately is that when it comes to specifically to the topic of Indian policy, not other kinds of areas about the frontier, but Indian policy specifically, the Lipset thesis explains a lot more because, frankly, the differences between Canadian government policy toward Indians and U.S. government policy as part of nation building and sovereignty were stark, to the point that the Indians themselves referred to the 49th parallel, the boundary between the U.S. and Canada, as the medicine line. And they call it the medicine line because they believed that this line on a map, that they had difficulty understanding what it was the boundaries were not part of their culture, that it had some sort of magic medicine. Because what they quickly realized that the soldiers in blue would not follow them if they crossed the boundary. And that Indians on the other side of the boundary were treated differently and usually better than the Indians south of the medicine line. And it became a color line as well because American soldiers wore blue and the Mounties wore red. And so there was a sense of the people in red uniforms, we will be treated fairly honorably compared to the people in the blue uniforms. And so this is where the term medicine line comes from. So in terms of the methodologies that I used, which is really the topic of this, I'm a qualitative comparativist, so I looked at various things. First of all, the conceptual framework itself that I just talked about is in itself qualitative and comparative. I've identified these three different areas, and the way I'm evaluating them is really by making arguments as to where do I see evidence for each one playing itself out, using largely secondary research, but also my own research as well. So I specify the details of the three approaches using a literature review, and then I apply them to the case study with qualitative description and comparison. And I would say that both Lipset and Borderlands are inherently comparative because they look at different countries and they compare them. So the conceptual approaches themselves are comparative, and then I'm comparing themselves against each other. So that's all sort of comparative aspect of it. And then also in terms of the case studies, I'm using what's called the most similar systems design, which is when you're looking at you're comparing two cases and you're looking at how are they most similar with the exception of maybe one important difference. And then looking at that difference, we can say to what extent does that difference help explain what's going on. So for example, looking at the United States and Canada, both democracies, both white settler colonies from the beginning, very, very similar in terms of their history, in terms of their culture, socioeconomic at the time and today, very, very similar. But there are important differences as well. On the other hand, if you did like a least similar systems design, you might say, okay, let's look at revolutions. And we're going to compare Iran and Russia and China and Cuba. And it's least similar, but what they have in common is that they went through revolutions. And so it's a different type of comparative case study design. I'm using the most similar systems design. So U.S., Canada, and then more specifically Montana and Alberta. Also, not only is it U.S., Canada, but I'm looking at very specific comparative time frames. So I'm looking at when Canada became a modern nation in 1867, when the U.S. Ends the Civil War and is unifying itself. We're looking at the same geographic territory, the same largely historical period as well, and a lot of the same socioeconomic forces that were driving immigration or emigration across the plains were affecting both countries. So there's a lot of similarities, and therefore you can get some really rich comparisons. Common geographic region as well. I did some archival research. So last spring, instead of taking students to Washington, I went to Alberta, and I spent spring break in southern Alberta, and I did research. I went down, I drove across the border. I actually physically saw the Alberta-Montana borderlands. In terms of archival research, the Glenbow Museum in Calgary is the major Canadian museum of the Canadian West, and they have incredible archives. I spent some days in the archives literally reading through the reports of the Northwest Mounted Police from the 1870s and 1880s. They brought literally dusty archives, and I was reading this stuff, and I put on a historian hat, and I really enjoyed it. In fact, as Ray Habersky mentioned, he said, I've gone over to the light side by doing this, right? But I found some really interesting things in the archives themselves, including a particular incident that I had not seen reported elsewhere after the Battle of Little Bighorn, when basically, you might know this, that Sitting Bull actually led his Sioux Indians across the border into Canada seeking refuge. And there was a big discussion as to whether or not, before they went over seeking refuge, they actually sent emissaries to the Blackfoot on the Canadian side, asking, would you be willing to join us to fight the whites? And if you come down and fight the whites in America, we're willing to come help you fight the whites in Canada. And so I actually read the reports of the Mounties basically reporting this back, making these really interesting arguments, or passing on what the Blackfoot had said. And basically the Blackfoot chief said, we don't want to engage in warfare against the Canadians and the Great Mother, meaning Queen Victoria, because we really like it here. But however, if they cross, basically he reported back to the chiefs reported back to the Mounties, if you protect us, in case the Sioux come across violently, we will actually put forth 2,000 warriors to help defend. And so the Mounties said, yes, of course, as long as you follow the law, we will protect you. And then that never happened. And then eventually the Sioux came across on their own, seeking refuge in Canada rather than seeking warfare in Canada. Also, I looked at different things. I looked at the records of the West. The Mounties also did their own. They were both judge, jury, and executioner on the prairies. That's one reason why they were able to do so much. And they actually put people on trial. And I found the records of the reports of incidents. And one of the most striking things I found was evidence of the fact that the Mounties treated whites and Indians equally. They would arrest and try whites for stealing horses from Indians off of reserves, just as they would do it the other way around. And this is part of their reputation of being fairly honorable. Field research, I went to some museum exhibits. I went a lot of different museums, looking at both factual material in the exhibits, but also how they presented the story, because they're actually building their own mythology of the Canadian frontier. And so I was looking at it as material culture. So I was looking at how are they presenting it, what kind of framework are they using, as well as factual information that I could use for the paper as well. Site visits, I'll pass. I went to various places. I also did some background interviews with some Blackfoot elders in Canada. That didn't end up in the article itself, but it gave me some good background information that I'll also use later on, because again, this is an ongoing project. Briefly, because I want to make sure I have time. So in terms of the explanatory factors, first of all, one of the things that's really important to understand is that although the Canadian record was much less violent than the American record, it isn't like the Canadian Indians were treated very well. But compared to the Americans, they were treated fairly well. But there was a lot of abuse and things like that on the Canadian side as well. But in terms of how do we explain why is it that overall treatment of American Indians was much worse than Canadian Indians, especially on the Great Plains and prairies, in that same general geographic area. There are several factors that I identify. We could call them variables. As a qualitative person, I might call them factors, but they really are variables. And what I do in the paper is I go through each one and I sort of discuss how these things play themselves out, and then how, using both the Lipset thesis or borderland studies, can we actually sort of interpret these and do these variables sort of give evidence or support for one in particular. There was some actual geophysical differences with the Laurentian Shield. We can talk about that over lunch if you want to talk about it. Demography, the Canadian West was much more sparsely populated, and the immigrants coming in the United States going west, it was much a stronger force as well. Frankly, let me just talk about the Laurentian Shield real quick, just for one important point. One major difference that had nothing to do with policy, and it had nothing to do with Canadians are more moral than Americans, although the Canadian self-image is that somehow there's something about Canadians that make us better than Americans, and a lot of Canadians like to make that point. But one of the things that made a very big difference was the fact that it was physically difficult, if not impossible, for settlers to cross the Canadian prairies until the railroad was built. So from the 1860s until 1885, you had this gap. And what that meant was it enabled the Canadian government in the form of the Mounties to go out, deal with the Indians, make treaties, get them on reserves, which is what they call reservations, and clear the area before white settlers arrived. The American history is very different. From the time of the Pilgrims, the American frontier was a moving frontier. The white Americans were continuously moving west and continuously encountering Indians, and you had clashes from the very beginning. When you look at the Canadian prairies, you didn't have that because, frankly, of this time gap that existed. And then by the time white settlers arrived, law and order was established. Canadians were on reserves, and you never had clashes, really any kind of major clashes between settlers and Indians, the way you had in the United States. And when the settlers were moving forward, they were continuously lobbying the U.S. government to send the army in and wipe out the Indians, basically. And that's pretty much what, so it was a very different kind of narrative that went on. Political institutions, I look at the differences between parliamentary form of government and presidential in terms of decision-making, in terms of actual making policy, and it was a very big difference. Canadian parliamentary system, you can actually have a consistent policy. They designed the Indian Act in 1876, was in effect until 1945, the same continuous policy. Whereas in the United States, you had Congress versus the president and the executive branch. You had the House versus the Senate. You had all these different lobbying forces that were going on. It made a very big difference in policy as well. Different attitudes about property on the reserves and reservations between the Canadian government and the American government. They looked at it differently. And then finally, one of the fundamental differences was state violence. The U.S. employed violence, and I go into some examples of specific massacres and things like that. The Canadians didn't. And really one of the major differences between the U.S. and Canada on this point is that where the United States government employed soldiers, the Canadian government employed policemen. And it was a very different understanding of how you approach your indigenous people. Do you do it as a military force? And again, the people running post-1865 frontier Indian policy were Sherman and Sheridan, the generals that basically fought the Civil War. And they fought American Indians as they fought the Confederacy. And it was that kind of a no-holds-barred approach. Canadians, stressing peace, order, and good government, basically approached it with policemen focusing on law and order, not focusing on military. And so these are the very big differences. All of these sorts of things sort of lend support to the peace, order, and good government, revolutionary society versus counter-revolutionary society. And in the case of Indian policy in particular, I find not that much support for the borderlands thesis because, frankly, in this case, the state and state sovereignty trumped any kind of differences between cultures that transcended borders. To the point where even the Blackfoot Indians on the Canadian side call themselves Blackfoot, and on the American side they call themselves Blackfeet. And they speak the same language, and they cross over to this day back and forth across the border. But they understand even, and they intermarry across. So they'll cross over. And I talk to people who do this to find a wife or something on the American side. But they fully understand that there's a difference between the U.S. and the Canadian. The sovereignty makes a very big difference. In other areas, and a lot of the borderland studies people, the scholars have talked about, for farmers and for people living on the frontier, homesteaders, things like that, they crossed the border back and forth all the time in the 19th century, and the border was just this idea. It didn't really make that much difference. But for Indians, it made a very big difference. Sometimes it was a matter of life and death. And so that's basically the conclusions I make in the article. And I want to end on time. And but I sort of gave you a little bit of the taste of the methodology that I used as well. So thank you. And I guess we're supposed to go to lunch, right? If there are any questions, we're going to sit at tables that say qualitative or quantitative, I think. But I'm free to talk to anybody if anybody wants to has a question at this point. Okay, sure. Sorry, it was a rapid fire, but.